Hello. Today I want to talk about the rise of Japan to international prominence in the late 19th century, up to and including the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. After the black ships of American Commodore Matthew Perry had opened Japan to foreign commerce in 1854 and ended several centuries of self-imposed international isolation, Japan entered into treaty relations with several of the European powers. Initially, perhaps the most important of these was with Russia, with the formal Treaty of Shimonoseki signed on the 7th of February, 1855. At that time, Russia was not yet a major Pacific power, and Russian negotiators were keen to stress Russia's good intentions towards Japan. Apart from establishing the basis for Russo-Japanese trade, the treaty also demarcated the two countries' claims to the islands to the north of Japanese Hokkaido, with the Kuril chain being divided between them, and Sakhalin Island being defined as neutral. By the 1870s, however, the newly emergent Japanese Empire was beginning to assert its international presence. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, which I will discuss in detail in other videos, had wrenched Japan into the modern age, hitherto essentially feudal patchwork of castle towns being replaced by an increasingly centralized constitutional monarchy. As part of a comprehensive westernization program involving the remaking of Japan's political, economic, and social structures, the Meiji reformers sought to make Japan a rich country with strong armed forces, the policy of Fukoku Kyuhei, with the new national army and navy being well resourced and enjoying considerable power within the emergent state. Of note, universal conscription was introduced in 1872, a Prussian-style general staff in 1878, and a naval war college in 1887. The officer corps of both army and navy also became imbued with a strongly nationalistic ethos, albeit with some differences between the German-influenced army and the British-mentored navy. Army officers in particular came to see themselves as the heirs of the samurai tradition, and for all officers the potent symbol of cherry blossom, which blossoms briefly in the spring of life and falls while flower is still perfect, could be seen as the ideal of their duty towards their nation. Japan's more assertive foreign policy was first marked by the effective ending of the Ryūkyū Kingdom in 1872. Hitherto, Ryu-Kyu, which controlled the main island chain to the south of the Japanese mainland, including Okinawa, had existed as a theoretically independent state, simultaneously subject to the Chinese Empire and to the Japanese lordship of Satsuma. It now became a Japanese province, with the legal fiction of independence continuing until 1879. At roughly the same time, to the north, the earlier 1855 Treaty of Shimonoseki with Russia was amended in the Treaty of St Petersburg of 1875, which gave Russia possession of Sakhalin Island in exchange for giving the entire Kuril chain, south of Kamchatka, to Japan, the northernmost Japanese island being within sight of the Russian coast. The Japanese also became interested in Korea, separated from Japan by the relatively narrow Korea Strait, and, apparently following the words of a Prussian military advisor to the Japanese army, increasingly described as a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. Certainly, with increasing aggression showed by the European powers towards an obviously weakened China, and forays by the French, Germans, and Americans into Korean territory, the Japanese had reason to be concerned about the possibility of foreign bases being established effectively on their doorstep. Instead, they decided that they would be the ones to force the opening of Korea, provoking a confrontation with the Koreans, and then occupying Korean territory to compel treaty negotiations in 1875. The resultant Treaty of Kanghua was signed on the 26th of February 1876, forcing Korea to abandon its traditional policy of isolation. This treaty, which was the first modern treaty entered into by the Koreans, opened 3 ports to Japanese trade, and established Japanese extraterritoriality. Also, by recognizing Korean independence, it implicitly implied the ending of Chinese suzerainty. Similar treaties between the Koreans and the Western powers followed. This opening of Korea laid the basis for a protracted struggle between China and Japan for influence, with each side having Korean proxies, as well as supporting rival factions in the Korean elite, crudely, with the Japanese supporting the modernizers and the Chinese supporting the traditionalists. Complex tensions led to a series of violent incidents and confrontations involving the rival powers, culminating in the First Sino-Japanese War, officially from August 1894 until April 1895. In June 1894, the Korean government had asked for Chinese assistance in suppressing the Tonghak Rebellion, China quickly responding by sending more than 2,000 troops. Unasked, the Japanese sent a larger body of troops and marines, reinforcing them when the Chinese appeared to be reasserting their suzerainty over Korea. British attempts to mediate between the two Asian powers were unavailing. In July, after the Korean government had rejected demands that it adopt a reform program, Japanese troops occupied Seoul, seizing the emperor and establishing a pro-Japanese government, which thereupon terminated all treaties with China and authorized Japanese forces to expel the Chinese. At this point, most Europeans underestimated the Japanese. China had also undertaken a program of military reform, and it was commonly assumed that Chinese forces were stronger than those of Japan. Both sides employed modern European weapons, and the conflict was observed with considerable interest by Westerners. As quickly became apparent, the Japanese were far stronger. In large part, this was due to the greater cohesiveness, discipline, and morale of the Japanese forces, which enabled them to repeatedly defeat the Chinese, even when the Chinese seemed stronger. Thus, whilst the Japanese had united commands for both their army and their navy, the Chinese had a number of separate armies and separate fleets, which did not cooperate with each other, so were not deployed to the best advantage. Again, the Chinese forces were seriously weakened by corruption, with the massive and systematic diversion of military funds into other government policies, such as the building of the Summer Palace, and into the pockets of individual officers. Specific results included shortages of ammunition and the poor maintenance of equipment, including some of the expensive ships acquired during China's military modernization. There were even stories of Chinese generals dismissing soldiers so as to pocket their wages, an admiral pawning one of the guns on a battleship to settle a gambling debt, and of gunpowder taken from explosive shells for sale on the black market, the powder being replaced with unexplosive cocoa. As to the common soldiers and sailors, their morale was often poor. Their pay was low, and their living conditions unpleasant. There was often a lack of effective training, discipline, and leadership. Basic safety procedures were ignored, and as a diversion, opium was fairly easily available. Specific problems in the Chinese Navy included ineffective communications, poorly maintained equipment, and a lack of gunnery practice. Hostilities began on the 25th of July 1894, with a naval engagement close to the Korean capital. Chinese ships and a British-flagged supply vessel were ferrying troops and war materiel to reinforce the Chinese forces stationed near Seoul, when they were intercepted by 3 Japanese cruisers. There were differing accounts as to the start of the battle, both sides accusing the other of opening fire, but the results were clear. 2 of the Chinese ships, together with the commercial supply vessel, sank or were captured. There were over 1,000 Chinese casualties, many of them drowned. There were no Japanese casualties, and none of the supplies or extra men were landed. 4 days later, on the 29th of July, about 4,000 Japanese troops attacked a comparable number of Chinese who were in entrenched positions south of Seoul at Songhwan, routing them. War was officially declared on the 1st of August. Whilst the Japanese consolidated their position in southern Korea, the Chinese moved their troops to the north, concentrating over 13,000 troops in well-defended positions in the ancient city of Pyongyang. The Japanese First Army arrived outside the city on the 15th of September. The Chinese forces were more numerous than the Japanese, and initially put up strong resistance before withdrawing with heavy casualties, establishing new positions on the Chinese side of the Yalu River, the Chinese-Korean border. 2 days later, on the 17th of September, the Japanese fleet attacked a slightly larger Chinese force off the mouth of the Yalu River, inflicting major damage and establishing Japanese dominance of all Korean waters, so preventing any further supplies reaching the Chinese army by sea. The battle was significant in terms of tactics, showing clearly the superiority of the Japanese attack formation in line ahead, that is one ship following another, over the Chinese defensive formation of gathering their ships around the two battleships in a wedge formation line abreast. This enabled the Japanese to rake the Chinese ships with concentrated fire from their 6-inch guns, even though the Chinese fleet was more heavily armed. By contrast, every Chinese ram attack failed. There were casualties on both sides, but Chinese losses were much greater, and 5 Chinese ships were sunk out of 14, with another 3 damaged. No Japanese ships were sunk, though some were damaged. Apart from tactics, Japanese gunnery and general seamanship were far superior to the Chinese, reflecting a greater emphasis on proper training. Meanwhile, the Japanese army moved towards the Chinese defenders along the Yalu River, the main force reaching their positions on the 23rd of October and starting their attack on the 25th. Despite having a superiority in numbers and having constructed defensive positions, the main part of the Chinese force quickly abandoned their positions after the Japanese advanced towards them, abandoning large stocks of weapons and supplies. The Japanese now divided their attack force into 2. One division moving towards the Manchurian capital of Mukden, modern Shenyang, to the northwest, whilst the second headed west and south into the strategically important Liaodong Peninsula, taking advantage of naval support to move troops quickly down the coast. The Japanese in the second force reached the outskirts of the key Chinese naval base of Lushun, known in the west as Port Arthur, on the 20th of November. They already had obtained detailed plans of the Chinese minefields and defences, which had been left behind by Chinese officers when they had abandoned the port town of Dalian to the north. Although Port Arthur was vital to China's defences, it controlled access to the inner part of the Yellow Sea, the Weihai Sea, and thus the seaward approach to Beijing. It also contained China's only modern dry docks for warship repairs, and had the strongest defences of any naval base in Northeast Asia. The Chinese made little effort to defend it. The ships of the Northern Fleet that were based there were withdrawn to ensure their safety, and many of the remaining army officers deserted the town when the Japanese arrived, leaving the defences to their subordinates. Most of Port Arthur was under Japanese control by the 22nd of November. According to the accounts of several Western journalists accompanying the victorious Japanese, the conquest of the city was accompanied by the massacre of at least some of the surviving Chinese soldiers and of those civilians who resisted. This topic remains controversial, however. By January 1895, the Japanese were ready to attack China's second major northern naval base at Weihai on the Shandong Peninsula to the south of the Weihai Sea. Like Port Arthur, its fortifications were considered impregnable, and it was well equipped with modern cannon. Making a feint to the west of the city on the 18th of January, the Japanese landed their army divisions to the east without opposition on the 22nd. Their forces converged on Weihai on the 29th of January. Although hampered by bitter winter weather, temperatures were as low as minus 26 degrees Celsius, they met only light resistance, the Chinese troops again fleeing before them. the Japanese took control of the port and its heavy guns on the 2nd of February, and were now able to attack the remnant of the Chinese northern fleet, some 15 warships as well as a dozen or more torpedo boats, from both land and sea. The Chinese admiral and his deputy committed suicide rather than surrender, and the senior officer remaining, a Scotsman named John McClure, surrendered the remnant of the fleet on the 12th of February, gaining permission for the peaceful departure of all Chinese troops and civilians and foreign military advisors. Hostilities had not yet ended, but Japan's position was now almost unassailable. There were major attacks by the Chinese in the northwest of the Liaodong Peninsula from December 1894 through to February 1895, but Chinese forces were demoralized by news of the loss of Weihai, and Japanese attacks secured several cities. Elsewhere, the Japanese took the port city of Haichao to the south of the Shandong Peninsula in March, making an advance on the vital Grand Canal possible. To the south, they also took the Pescadores Islands between Taiwan and the mainland, which were secured in 3 days in late March against minimal resistance. This gave the Japanese a major strategic position against southern China and provided them with control of access to Taiwan, which they had now determined to take as one of the spoils of war. Negotiations to end the war began on the 20th of March and were concluded on the 17th of April 1895 with the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, an event which marked a sea change in relations between the East Asian powers and which I will discuss in the next video. Thank you.